I'm a researcher at a university, and this is my story. I was about 25 or 26 when it happened, and I still remember it vividly to this day. On some days, when the weather was nice, I would prefer to spend my lunch hour strolling around the university grounds outside, or sitting underneath a shady tree on a bench. It was a nice break from being cooped up in a lab all day. One day, while I was sitting on a bench, a male student walking by asked if he could sit next to me. I'm a pretty shy and awkward kind of person, so even though I really would have preferred sitting alone, I said, "Sure." He initiated simple conversation, to which I obliged, but being careful not to be too forthcoming. He mentioned he had seen which departmental building I came and went from, which slightly alarmed me, given I had never seen this person before in my life. But I pushed the thought from my mind. After all, the weather had been decent lately, and I had spent nearly all my lunch hours for the past week outside. He asked if I was studying within the mentioned department, to which I told him that I was not a student, but rather I worked there. He told me he was an engineering student, and then followed up with asking me out to coffee sometime. I apologized and told him that I had a boyfriend and would have to decline. We parted ways after that, and I assumed I probably wouldn't see him around again. About a week or two went by, and I was spending another lunch hour outside on campus, sitting on a different bench somewhere. Seemingly out of nowhere, the same man from before asked if he could sit next to me again. Admittedly, I don't remember what he started talking to me about at first. My mind was reeling, and I was rather uncomfortable having to potentially turn this guy down a second time. Sure enough, he asked me again if we could go out for coffee sometime. I apologized and reminded him that I had a boyfriend and would not be meeting him for coffee. And again, he left after that. I was feeling rather anxious now, but it still hadn't reached a level where I felt I had to be too concerned. A few days later, I had finished work and was leaving the building to walk to where I had parked my car. I usually parked on the street about a 10-minute walk away from campus. My walking route would take me down several quiet residential streets with minimal car traffic. Even pedestrian traffic was pretty sparse on the busiest of days. It wasn't until I was about halfway to my car, down one of these quiet back streets, that I noticed someone walking directly across the street from me, but keeping a few paces behind. I noticed him from my peripheral vision and didn't want to flat out turn around to stare at him. It wasn't uncommon to see someone else by any means. I was just always trying to be aware of my surroundings when walking the streets alone. I had to make a few turns coming up anyways, and the chance that they would be going the same way as me was slim. But he did. He made all the turns I did, still walking on the sidewalk across from me, a few steps behind. I still did not want to look at whoever this was. I didn't want him to know that I was aware of what I thought he was doing. I quickened my pace to a speedy walk. I was approaching the first of two busier streets before I would reach my car. His pace quickened to keep up with me. That was the moment I panicked, the moment I was sure that he was indeed following me. After that, I started a full-out jog to cross the first of the busier streets. He ran to keep up behind me and was now on the same side of the street I was. I was now nearly at my car. I had to cross the last busy street and get about 100 meters, and I would be there. But it was crossing the street that worried me. I often had to stop and wait a good minute or so before it was clear enough to do so. If this were the case, he would catch up with me. As if the stars aligned, as soon as I made it running to the busy street, I had a gap to cross. I booked it as fast as I could, finally turning around once I had made it, to look and yell at the man who had been pursuing me. It was him. I could have suspected, but now it was confirmed. It was the engineering student whom I had turned down for coffee. "Stop following me," I yelled at him from across the busy street. "Can I just talk to you?" he yelled back. I didn't even answer him. I mean, the answer should have been obvious from the start, and I was certainly never going to give him the chance to talk to me again. I got into my car and locked the doors as quickly as possible and drove away. I was shaking and felt like I was going to be sick. I felt violated and vulnerable knowing that someone had been following me without my knowledge. It took me a while to feel safe again, and I made sure to always be aware of my surroundings from then on. I also made sure to never let my guard own around strangers, no matter how innocent they may seem. The night shift at my work was mostly uneventful. I was exhausted after taking double shifts all week to make ends meet. As I handed an order to a customer at the second drive-through window, he asked if I was single. I lied and said I had a boyfriend, hoping he'd leave me alone. But when I left work, His truck was waiting in the parking lot. I walked quickly to my car, heart pounding as his engine roared to life and his headlights flicked on. He pulled up behind my car, blocking me in. As he knocked on my window, I cracked it open slightly. "Now that it's just us, do you want to reconsider giving me your number?" he asked, grinning. "No," I snapped. "Leave me alone or I'm calling the police." He laughed, putting his hands up in mock surrender. He returned to his truck and drove off. I took the long way home, checking constantly that I wasn't followed. A couple weeks later, I noticed an anonymous account had viewed my TikTok profile 30 times. The only video showing my face had a comment, "Seen that face in person every day, always makes me happy." My blood ran cold. I went to the police again, but they dismissed it as not a crime. My parents were terrified and insisted I move in with them. Then my neighbor called. He'd seen the blue truck slowly pass by my house. I'm horrified. I don't want to sell my house, but if this stalker isn't caught, I may have to. I live in fear of where he might turn up next. All because I made the mistake of catching the eye of the wrong customer on a late night at McDonald's. A few days after moving in with my parents, I was cleaning out my attic and found an old diary of mine from high school. As I read through the pages of my messy handwriting, something caught my eye. An entry described a school dance I attended 15 years ago, where I met a shy boy named Jake. We danced together and even shared a kiss. I never saw him again after that night, quickly forgetting about my first kiss. Until now. A cold feeling of dread crept over me as memories flooded back. Jake had fiery red hair and drove an old, beat-up pickup truck. At the time, I thought his nervousness was endearing, but now his behavior seemed disturbing. He had asked me question after question, needing to know every detail about my life and schedules. I remembered feeling unsettled when I saw him watching me from across the parking lot as I left that night. My hands shook as I frantically searched social media looking for any trace of Jake. Nothing. No profiles under that name lived in my hometown. But on a whim, I searched the username from the TikTok account, and there he was. His profile picture showed a middle-aged man with the same red hair I remembered, although now unkempt and streaked with gray. His profile was locked down, but in the small description section he had written simply, "I never forgot." Nausea rose in my throat. Jake had fixated on me after one high school dance, and now 15 years later, his obsession had led him to find me again. The pieces clicked into place. His appearances everywhere I went couldn't be coincidence. He must have been following me, learning my routines and schedule without my knowledge, waiting for his chance to make contact again. I called the police once more, providing this new evidence about Jake's identity and the history of his stalking behavior. At last, they took the situation seriously and promised to investigate. They suggested I continue staying away from my home in case he was monitoring it. A week later, 2 police officers came to my parents' house. They had tracked down Jake to a rundown trailer on the outskirts of town and brought him in for questioning. At first, he denied any wrongdoing, but when confronted with the irrefutable proof of his stalking, he broke down into tears and confessed. Jake's mental health had severely declined over the years as his obsession with me intensified. He admitted to following me for months, hoping for any glimpse of the young girl he had danced with once so long ago. When he saw me again at McDonald's that night, it felt like destiny, and he could no longer control his actions. He apologized for frightening me, but insisted he would never actually hurt me. His love for the girl from the dance had sustained him for 15 years. A restraining order was issued, and Jake began mandatory counseling. I finally felt safe enough to return home, although still haunted by the knowledge of what might have been if Jake's sickness had escalated further. His deluded love had come close to destruction, and a simple act of teenage kindness had nearly turned into my worst nightmare. I still dread each drive-through encounter, never knowing what sinister secrets may lie behind the next pair of headlights in the night.